Today we will discuss the one sample t-test, which is ito yung equivalent ng z-test when the population standard deviation is unknown. The student t-test can be used to assess the population mean when the population standard deviation is unknown. At para palitan yung ating population standard deviation, we will use the sample standard deviation. So our test value or the test statistic is T is equal to the mean of the sample minus the mean of the population divided by the sample standard deviation over the square root of the sample size. So before we can use the student t-test, kailangan muna natin i-check itong 5 assumptions na ito. First, the sample was randomly selected dapat. Second, the dependent variable must be continuous. Ibig sabihin, nasa interval or ratio level siya. Number 3, the data should be independent, indicating no relationship between the observations. Number 4, there should be no significant outliers, so we can check that using a box plot. And finally, the dependent variable should be approximately normally distributed, so we can check this using the Shapiro-Wilk test. Ngayon, what if yung fifth assumption ay hindi na-satisfy? Meron ba tayong ibang test na pwedeng gamitin? So, meron tayong tinatawag na Wilcoxon Rank test. It is a non-parametric alternative to the student's t-test when the data do not follow a normal distribution. So, let's have some examples. A medical investigation asserted that the average number of infections per week at a hospital in southern Philippines was 16.3. To assess this claim, a random sample of 10 weeks revealed a mean of 17.7 infections with a sample standard deviation of 1.8 and was validated to be normally distributed. So is there sufficient evidence to reject the investigator's claim at a significance level of 0.05? So dito makikita natin na random yung ating samples. So no problem doon sa first assumption. Second assumption, dapat continuous daw. Okay? So yung number of infections naman natin is continuous. Pangatlo, independent ba? So we cannot check that dito sa problem na to kasi hindi naman given yung data natin. Pero we assume na siya ay independent. Number 4 is no outliers. So since hindi rin given yung data natin, we cannot check that. Okay? So we only assume na no outlier. And finally, it was validated to be normally distributed, so normal siya. So we can now proceed with the student t-test. First step, our null hypothesis is the mean is equal to 16.3 and that is our claim. And for the alternative hypothesis, the mean is not equal to 16.3. Now, for the test statistic, using our formula, t is equal to 17.7 minus 16.3 over 1.8 over square root of 10, which gives us a value of 2.4595. Since this is two-tailed and our DF is 9, our p-value is 0.0362. Now, comparing our p-value and our alpha, since p is less than our alpha, we reject our null hypothesis. Since rejected ang ating null hypothesis, then we conclude that there is enough evidence to reject the investigator's claim and that the average number of infection is not equal to 16.3. Now, for the second example, given na tayo ng data. As per payscale.com, the average starting salary for a nurse in the Philippines was asserted to be 39,750 pesos. Test the assertion that the starting salary was less than that. A random sample of 8 newly employed nurses was chosen and their starting salaries in pesos were presented below. Is there sufficient evidence to support the researcher's claim at a significance level of 0.01? So kapag ganitong mga problems na given yung data natin, gagamit tayo ng Jamovie para i-test yung ating hypothesis. Particularly, yung step 2 at saka step 3, doon natin sa Jamovie i-run. So first, we have to check the assumptions. The samples were randomly selected. Okay, it was stated in the problem. Second, ang salary naman is continuous. So check tayo sa assumption number 2. For assumption number 3, the data values are independent. Now, for assumption number 4, we have to check it using the Jamovie. So how do we check? How do we run a t-test in Jamovie? So these are the steps. First, you open your Jamovie, then label and enter the data. Make sure that it is continuous. Next, check the assumption for outliers, which is the box plot. Then go to Analysis, t-test, one sample t-test. Then under Assumptions check the assumption of normality. Then under Hypothesis, indicate the tail and the mean or the test value. Yung test value na sinasabi dito, yun yung ating mean. Okay? And under Test, check students or Wilcoxon Rank, depende kung ano yung appropriate na gagamitin mo. So in your Jamovie, open your Jamovie, and then go to Data, then Set Up, then ilagay ninyo yung sa data variable ninyo, yung pangalan ng data ninyo. So in this case, salaries. Then make sure na continuous siya. And then pindutin niyo yung arrow na nakataas. And then next, ilagay na natin yung ating data. And then next is we have to check if may significant outlier ba. So go to Analysis, Exploration, then Descriptives. Tapos lalabas itong window na ito. Yung salaries ninyo dito, ililipat natin siya doon sa variables. Okay? So pag nalipat na natin siya sa variables, go to plots, then check box plot. So in the output, makikita ninyo na wala naman tayong significant outlier. Therefore, assumption 4, no significant outliers. And for assumption number 5, go to Analysis, t-test, then one sample t-test. Then magpapakita itong window na ito. Again, ilipat nyo yung salaries doon sa dependent variable ninyo. So pag nalipat nyo na, go to Assumption Checks doon sa baba. Check nyo yung normality at saka yung QQ plot. So in the normality, since P is greater than alpha, we say that the distribution is normal. At makikita nyo din doon sa kanyang QQ plot na malapit lang sila doon sa linya. So, assumption number 5, the distribution of samples is normal. So since yung 5 assumption ay satisfied, we can proceed with the student t-test. First step, your null hypothesis is that the mean is equal to 39,750, while the alternative hypothesis is that the mean is less than 39,750, and that is the claim. For step 2 and step 3, tulad nga ng sabi ko kanina, gagamitan natin siya ng Jamovie. How will you find the test statistic and the p-value in the Jamovie? So punta tayo dun sa may hypothesis na part, ilalagay nyo sa test value yung 39,750. And then indicate niyo yung tail, which is less than the test value. From there, check nyo yung students kasi nasatisfy naman natin yung 5 assumption. And then in the output, makikita niyo dyan, the statistic is negative 1.77. That is your step 2. And the p-value is 0.060. That is your step 3. Since our p is greater than alpha, then do not reject the null hypothesis. So our conclusion is there is not enough evidence to support the claim and that the average nurse salary is 39,750. Example number 3. A researcher claims that the average height of buildings in a large city with 30 floors and above was less than 700 feet. A random sample of 10 buildings was selected and their heights in feet were shown below. At a significance level of 0.05, is there enough evidence to support the claim? So let's check the assumptions. First assumption, the samples were randomly selected. Second assumption, height of building is continuous. Third assumption, the data values are independent. Then using the Jamovie, it is shown na wala naman tayong significant outlier. So no significant outliers for assumption number 4. And for the normality test, you can see that the P is 0.415, which is greater than alpha. So the distribution is normal. Okay? And back up by the QQ plot, makikita ninyo na normal talaga siya. So the distribution of samples is normal for assumption 5. So since the 5 assumptions were satisfied, we can now go to t-test. So step 1, the null hypothesis is that the mean is equal to 700, and the alternative hypothesis is that the mean is less than 700, and that is the claim. For step 2 and step 3, so makikita natin sa Jamovie, don't forget dito sa hypothesis natin, ilagay natin yung tail at yung test value natin. So 700, tapos less than. So yung student's t-test natin shows that the statistic is negative 3.73, while the p-value is 0.002. So since p is less than alpha, we reject the null hypothesis. So our conclusion is that there is enough evidence to support the claim that the average height of buildings in that large city with 30 floors and above was less than 700 feet. Example number 4. The National Novel Writing Association stated that a typical novel comprises at least 50,000 words. To test this claim, a writing club at a certain high school had randomly selected novels with the number of words as shown below. At a significance level of 0.05, is there sufficient evidence to conclude that the mean number of words is greater than 50,000? So we check the assumptions. The samples were randomly selected. Second, the number of words is continuous. Third assumption, the data values are independent. Then, sa Jamovie natin, the box plot shows na meron tayong isang significant outlier. So there is one significant outlier for assumption 4. For assumption 5, yung normality test natin, P is 0.002, which means that P is less than alpha. So, hindi normal yung ating distribution, as you can see doon sa ating QQ plot. So for assumption 5, the distribution of samples is not normal. So since hindi na-satisfy yung ating assumptions, especially the normality, we will use the Wilcoxon Rank test. So step 1, our HO is that the mean is equal to 50,000. And the alternative hypothesis is that the mean is greater than 50,000, and that is our claim. So we will check the Wilcoxon rank, okay? Pero note that dapat sa test value nakalagay yung mean and then yung kanyang tail. So your W is 28.00 and your P is 0.098. So for step 2, W is equal to 28. Kasi Wilcoxon yung ginamit, hindi yung student. And for step 3, P is 0.098. So since P is greater than alpha, we do not reject the null hypothesis. So our conclusion is that there is not enough evidence to support the claim. So on the average, a typical novel comprises 50,000 words.